Population. We're now in Unit 3, and the first concept we'll discuss in Unit 3 is the concept of population. So let's get going. All right, so when we talk about population as the movement, the first thing we want to discuss with population is migration. And migration is simply the movement of people from place to place. And taking a look at this graphic, the graphic explains migration. It kind of summarizes what migration is, in that you have people moving from one continent to the other. You see the arrow directing people from moving from from North America to Europe and Africa, and from Africa and Europe to South America. So that's basically what migration is, the movement of people from place to place. When we get into migration, there are a couple of factors that cause people to move, and we'll discuss some of them. It's basically a review from the 5 themes in movement, and that are pull factors. Pull factors are some conditions that attract people to a certain place. We talked about this briefly with our movement, but some examples of pull factors are friends and family. If you're a religion and going in a religious missionary, sometimes, especially when you talk about the founding of the United States, the promise of freedom, religious and political freedom. That was why this country was founded. People came here for religious freedom. Jobs, industry, and education. So people looking for better jobs or better education, a better life for their family. And push factors are things that drive people away, that drive people from one place to another. So they are the opposite of pull factors. Push factors are the opposite of pull factors. And some examples of push factors are things that drive people from an area would be things like crop failures, food shortages, wars, poverty, crime, unemployment, natural disasters, and something that we'll spend a little bit of time today discussing is overpopulation. A couple of concepts that work with population and movement and population movement is urbanization. And urbanization is the movement of people from the cities to a town. But before we get to urbanization, let's go to internal migration. Internal migration is the movement of population within a country. And this graphic is an example of internal migration. It shows people moving within the United States, the internal migration within the United States. The people move from one region to one region or another in the United States. And it shows a good bit of people have moved from the west and the north to the south. Those are normally people who are retiring and they're moving south. Because their dollar is worth more in the South and it's warmer. Urbanization. Now it's time to get to urbanization. That is the movement of people from the rural areas to the city, and that is symbolized by this graphic by the large city. So as a result of people moving from the countries or suburbs to the cities, that's called urbanization. And metropolitan areas, those are just cities and their surrounding urbanized areas. So the best example of a metropolitan area I can think of would be Baton Rouge, even though it's not really considered a city. Probably New Orleans would be the best example of a metropolitan area. The closest one to us, New Orleans, and that would include the city of New Orleans as well as the Slidell, Kenner, Metairie, the West Bank. The same thing with Houston. Houston would be another good example of a metropolitan region. It would be Houston and all the surrounding suburbs of it. The Woodlands, all the millions of suburbs around Houston. Moving forward with population, we'll discuss a couple or some other types of movement. And the first will be international migration. And international migration is population movement from one country to another. Another one is immigration. And right now we're distinguishing between the words immigration and immigration. So really quick. Immigration with the I, that means when you enter one country or a region from which you're not native. So when you're coming to another country, so when you leave your country to go to another country, that is immigration. People immigrate to another country and are referred to as immigrants in a new country. Now, immigration is with an E, is when you leave one country or region for another, and people immigrate from a country and are referred to as immigrants in their home country. So when you go somewhere else, you're called an immigrant. So when you're leaving, you're called an immigrant. And when the people in your home country, they will call you an immigrant with an E. Do not worry about that. We do not spend a whole lot of time on it. It could be a little. We do not spend a whole lot of time on it. But this graphic is an example of immigration and immigration. It shows people how people have left or immigrated from one part of Europe, where people immigrate from Europe. So you'll see in Asia, a lot of people immigrate from Asia to Europe. Also, they immigrate from Asia to the United States. We have people from Central America immigrating to the United States, people from South Asia immigrating to Europe. So this is a graph that shows immigration patterns of the world. One type of migration that we'll discuss is voluntary migration, and it's just what it says. It's when people move by choice, okay? So it's when people move by choice. Oftentimes you'll think about if you have a job or a better job opportunity or a better education opportunity or a better life for your family. And going with voluntary migration is the concept of mobility. And what mobility is, that is the quality of you being able to move freely. If you're able to move freely in comfort, okay? So, mobility. Now, there are some forced or involuntary migrations. And forced migration is exactly what you think about. It's involuntary migration. It's when you're made to move against your wishes. This generally occurs for a couple of times. This generally occurs a couple ways. With natural disasters, when you think about examples of natural disasters, you think about volcanoes, you think about earthquakes, you think about the earthquakes in Haiti, you can think about Hurricane Katrina. Those people, they had to leave. They did not want to leave. They did not plan on leaving. They were forced to leave. Wars. In countries that there are a lot of wars, there are people leave because of it's just not a safe place to be anymore. And different types of developmental policies and projects where people are allowed to, where their homes may be being destroyed or their homes are being, I think I used the example in the movement video in places like that had public housing, as the public housing was being destroyed, like in New Orleans or Chicago and the major cities, that would cause people to move. That is an example of developmental projects. So the building of dams, roads, ports, airports, mining, deforestation, all of these things can be developmental policies and projects that would cause people to move. They're all examples of forced migration. Now, there are a few people or different types of people who are forced to migrate, and we have a different terms for them. So let's kind of review some of those now. Some people who are forced to migrate include people you call refugees, people who are migrate or referred to as being displaced. That's a way of just saying that you no longer live where you are. So being displaced is just a technical term, or I guess a nice way of saying that you no longer live in your home. And refugees are people who leave one country to escape natural disaster or persecution or religious or political persecution. So refugees are people who will go from one country to another to escape religious persecution or disaster. And if you guys are too young but to recall this, but people who escaped or evacuated from New Orleans were called refugees, and that was an incorrect term because, like was just pointed out, that a refugee is someone from another country. These are people from the United States moving from one part of the United States to another. Another part of people that are moved involuntarily, which is something that's actually growing, which is the trafficking movement. People are human trafficking, human slavery today. Oftentimes it's sex crimes with young girls. So that is another and a very scary trend that we have of forced migration. And these are people who are moved by deception or coercion for policies, for purposes of exploitation. So there are people out there who profit from trafficking people and for slavery or sexual slavery and moving around the country into different countries. All right, that's it. This is the end of population. Have a good evening. See you in class.